Hi, it's Maya here, and it's time to talk about the books that I read in February. The first book that I read I already reviewed in my January wrap-up, and that was The Aeronauts Windless by Jim Butcher. If you want to see my thoughts of it, go watch the previous month's wrap-up. I gave it 2.5 stars, it was okay. The second actual book that I finished was A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers, and I had heard such great things about this book, so I was expecting a lot. But sadly, I didn't love this as much as a lot of people seem to love it. I thought it was fine, I liked it, but I didn't fall in love with it. It's a story about a group of people who are wormhole builders, and they work in this spaceship, the tunneling ship, and they get a big gig. So they have to travel a long way to this politically unstable planet, and then punch a wormhole through to back to the livelier parts, and sort of create a highway for other ships to use. What I really loved about this book was the world building, the different alien races, the different planets, the different cultures. These were all fantastically thought out. There were a lot of different aliens, a lot of different cultures, and Chambers has done a really huge job with this. Every culture that we meet felt like a complete culture of its own with its own history. It almost felt like playing Mass Effect. With that, I don't mean that the cultures are similar. I just mean that the aliens and their customs were very fleshed out and varied, even perhaps more than in Mass Effect, and it felt like a completely real world. And all the aliens were clearly distinguishable from each other, which I thought was great. Instead of a big plot, this is more of a slice of life type of story. I usually love character-based stories, but for some reason this just didn't work for me that well. The stories were these snapshots of a character's life, but they also felt a bit too compartmentalized, even episodic. It felt like going through a list of characters, like now you get a story, and now you get a story, and now it's your turn to get a story. And that bothered me a bit. I wanted them to mix more naturally together, and I also wanted more scenes where most of the people on the ship would be together doing something every day and talking at the same time. There were a lot of scenes where two characters were talking one-on-one, and it left me craving for this sort of everyday spaceship work stuff, where a lot more people would talk to each other, interact with each other. Sometimes the one-on-one conversations were only about the character explaining their race and their customs to another character, but also in the book there were used these Wikipedia-like entries that told a bit about the different races, and I think those could have been utilized more so that the conversations between two characters would have felt more natural and could have perhaps focused on some more personal things instead of explaining the alien race and their customs to another character. This feels a bit weird to me to say that I would have preferred a real info dump instead of this more conversational way to tell this stuff, but it wasn't that organically embedded info dump. It still felt like an info dump, so I would have just preferred it as a separate thing. The book focused a lot on the characters' inner life, on their feelings, and that can be great, but it was at times a bit heavy-handed. By that I mean that the characters spoke their feelings out loud to the point that it felt like they were telling us their feelings instead of showing what they felt. The worst offender that comes to mind is the bolt sorting scene, the scene where Jenks drops all these sort of bolts on the floor and then makes a long speech about his feelings, which I think would have been apparent from the scene in itself without needing to be vocalized, and I think the scene would have been stronger if that speech would have been left out, because I got his emotional state from the scene itself. Now this review might feel a bit harsh because I focused so much about the things I didn't like, but I did also like reading this book. I think my favorite character was Dr. Chef, and I would have hoped to see more of him. Also Sissix, who belongs to this reptilian race. Out of the characters, I have to say that Kissy got on my nerves a little bit, but I managed to get over it. As I said, I loved the world and all the different alien races, and I would have really liked to be able to give this book more than 3 stars, but I had just too many minor gripes with it to give it more. This was Becky Chambers' debut novel, and I think that she can only get better, and as I really like the world building, I will be reading her next novel that also takes place in this same universe, and I hope that I will enjoy it more. So that was A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, and next I read St. Joe's Sorcerer to the Crown. It's a Regency fantasy book, so it takes place in the Regency era, but with magic added, and that's something that I really like. The main character is Zachariah White, who is Britain's first black sorcerer to the crown, or royal sorcerer. And he doesn't have that easy a time with it, because his predecessor sort of passed the staff to him in suspicious or mysterious circumstances, and the other magicians, the British white magicians, aren't that thrilled to see a black man as the Sorcerer Royal. Another character in this book is Prunella Gentleman, who is half British and half Indian. She works in a school that teaches young women to suppress their magic, because of course only gentlemen are allowed to do magic. Her guardian is the headmistress of the school, and Prunella helps around at the school and has learned quite a bit of magic herself in the process. And Zachariah is coming to the school to give a speech to the women, and Prunella and him meet, and a lot of stuff happens. I really like the main pair. I think they had a great dynamic. Zachariah is more reserved and polite, and Prunella is very outspoken and ambitious, and I really like that. And I really liked following the two together. The book wouldn't have worked as well at all if it focused only on one or the other of the characters. I think they balanced each other out. Prunella provided a lot of comedy because she was so outspoken that she left the bit more reserved British men sputtering in her wake, and Zachariah was more of a grounding presence. This book feels very light and fun to read, even though it also tackles some serious topics like women's rights and racism and colonialism. What especially struck me about the more serious topics in the book is the way Zachariah is able to take politely even the most outlandish attacks, verbal or otherwise, to his person, because he's just grown so used to it, living as a black boy in Britain. While his friends, of course, when they hear of this stuff, are completely outraged because they haven't had to face these sort of things on everyday basis as they grew up. And it really showed how he had been raised in a country that didn't accept him, and how he just wasn't surprised by any of the hatefulness anymore. This is Jo's debut novel, and there were perhaps some unpolished aspects about the storytelling, but it was a fun read and a quick read. I found it much too fun to really care about perhaps any weaker points. So if you are into Fancy of Manners books in the Magical Regency books and want something fun to read, I really recommend this. I gave it 4 stars. I also read one comic trade paperback and one short story in February. The comic was Lumberjanes Volume 1 by Noel Stevenson, Grace Ellis and Shannon Waters. Am I leaving someone out? Brooke A. Allen. This is a comic aimed at teens. It's about this group of Lumberjane scouts, sort of Girl Scouts, who are on this summer camp, and they stumble across supernatural shenanigans, and it has a bit of the feel of Scooby-Doo, except the supernatural stuff is real, and it's a lot of fun. In the beginning there were some panel sequences that didn't flow that great, but I think it got over that after the first 2 issues. It was just a lot of fun, and I really hope that it would be translated to Finnish, because I would love to buy it for my niece-in-law. The short story that I read was Mary Robinette Kowal's Midnight Hour, which is a fairy tale short story that is very striking and very hard-hitting, and I recommend that all of you go read it now. I'll link it down below. I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4.5 stars. So that was everything I read in February. You might have noticed that I didn't get to The Trader, or Trader Barry Cormorant by Seth Dickinson, which I mentioned in my February TBR. I have to return this on Monday, so I better get to it. I'm also still reading Memory and Dream by Charles DeLint. I think I started this in January, and I am reading it slowly, but even though I'm reading it slowly, I'm really enjoying it, and I'm pretty much exactly halfway through right now. And then there's a graphic novel that I'm planning to read, and that is Descender by Jeff Lemire and Dustin Nguyen, and it is Volume 1, 10 stars. This is nominated for the Booktube SFF Awards, and it's a science fiction graphic novel. I also bought Batgirl Volume 2, Family Business, and you might remember that I wasn't the hugest fan of Batgirl Volume 1, but I just adore Bab Star's artwork, so I bought the second one. Even though I noticed that this has a lot of guest artists, so that I might not be getting as much Bab Star as I hoped when I bought this one. So those were all the books that I read in February. Let me know what you read in February. What was your favorite book or favorite thing that you read in February? And I hope you have a great reading month in March, and I'll see you later.